It's 2 o'clock, so I think we'll go ahead and begin. We might be a small audience, but we're a mighty audience. I want to welcome you all today to the program on Kansas music history. I first ran into Derrick, and we were both on a panel for Humanities Kansas in Manhattan. And just listening to him talk and all the things he was doing, I thought, oh, we got to have him come out here. And luckily, we were able to book that. The program is brought to us by Humanities Kansas. They do the funding of the speaker for us. And Humanities Kansas is an independent nonprofit organization that promotes the ideas of empowering the people of Kansas to strengthen our communities and actually to add some diversity to our communities. So right now, if you turn, I need to do that too, turn off our cell phones so that we can enjoy the program. And as we begin, let's remember that the information presented, as well as what we share and discuss, is of value to all of us and of interest. We will respect one another even if we have different points of view. And isn't that an interesting thing that Humanities Kansas has to promote, that we have to be reminded to respect all different points of view right now. We won't always be in agreement, but we need to respect the different points of view. Derrick Doty is a music historian, and he currently works at the Riley County Historical Society in Manhattan. If you've never been to their museum, I highly recommend it. He has taught music lessons for over 20 years, specializing in piano, guitar, fiddle, and mandolin. He currently plays fiddle in the Tallgrass Express String Band, a folk group based in the Flint Hills, which plays original songs about the region. So, please welcome Derrick Doty.
Well, thank you. I should make a slight correction. I'm a little late on my updated information, but I actually don't work at the Riley County Museum anymore. I ended that last year. But yes, you should still go check it out because there's lots of great stuff there to see. So Kansas music history. There's so much that I could share with you. A lot of these subjects we're going to touch on today, we could probably spend an entire hour just on them, whether it's talking about the banjo, Wendell Hall, just a number of things that we could really go into depth on. But I'm just going to try to touch the highlights, the things that I hope you're going to be most interested in, and mostly just trying to educate, because a lot of people aren't aware of some of this information, and that's largely because most of it has not been well documented. A lot of the things that I like to share about are the informal music traditions, and that's like the fiddlers and the banjo players and the house dances, the barn dances. And those are informal traditions. They're leisure activities, and by nature they just go undocumented. We don't take the time to record them, to write about them. They're things that live in our memory. A lot of these stories and things just live in our memory. And fortunately, I run into people who share these memories, and if it weren't for that, that story would have been lost. And so what I try to stress to people is the importance of writing down your family's histories, your family's stories, and documenting this, because we've already lost so much. So starting out with the fiddlers, because that's what I'm really passionate about. I like to play the fiddle, and I like to try to understand as much as I can about Kansas fiddling and fiddlers. And as I said, we don't have a whole lot of information about them. If you look at our neighbor, Missouri, they've got a long and rich history of fiddling that continues today. And just because we don't see that in Kansas doesn't mean that it wasn't there. It was. And I've got plenty of information that proves that. But in Missouri, there's this guy who has written 3 books that thick on Missouri fiddling traditions. And I wish that I could fill one book that thick on Kansas fiddling traditions. But as we'll see, a lot of those stories were lost. And there may be a number of reasons for that. Sometimes it could be religious reasons. I've read through many diaries and letters and books that people have written who've settled in Kansas. And sometimes you will not find any mention of fiddle, banjo, dancing, and that might be because of their religious beliefs. If they were Methodists, which quite often you have a lot of Methodists moving to Kansas, they didn't approve of dancing. I'm not sure if they still don't. But Isaac Goodnow from Manhattan, he was a Methodist. He didn't approve of dancing. He liked music. He enjoyed listening to music. He specifically said he liked waltzes and polkas and things like that, but he liked that music. He didn't approve of dancing to it. So that might be one reason why you have the absence of these stories, is because that wasn't a part of that person's life, and so they weren't involved in it. But occasionally in these letters and diaries and whatnot, we will find some golden information, like Luna Warner from Smith County, Kansas. She lived just south of Downs in the 1870s. She was about 16 years old, and she kept a diary. And dancing was a part of her life, and she mentions quite a bit going to house dances, going into town to Cocker City, Osborne, different places where they might have a 4th of July dance. And in fact, one dance that she talked about was like at a neighbor's house a few miles away. They went to the house. They didn't know anybody, but they were invited. And she said that they had 2 fiddlers playing. She said they weren't very good, but they had 2 fiddlers nonetheless. And that's something we do see often for these dances. If you had only one instrument, it would be a fiddle. If you had 2 instruments, it would probably be 2 fiddles. Anything more, you were fortunate to have that. So one thing that I'm asked at every talk is, what's the difference between a violin and a fiddle? So I've decided I better address that right away instead of saving that for you to ask me later. So there's lots of answers to that question. To give you the academic answer, the violin is what I consider the formal name of the instrument, and the fiddle would be the informal name of the instrument. There's also another way that you can look at it. You can look at it as the violin being the noun. We're talking about the instrument. And fiddle can be the verb. We're talking about what we do with the instrument. We fiddle. That's another way of talking about it, knowing the difference. But the reality is, there's no difference between the instruments. It's one and the same. They might be set up differently between a violinist and a fiddler. One of the stories that I enjoy from an 1890s newspaper in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, was a story about this old gentleman who was a longtime citizen of Pittsburgh. When he was a young man, he drove Conestoga wagons over the Allegheny Mountains and delivered freight. And so this would have been about the 1840s, probably, that this story occurred. And he picked up a load in Harrisburg and was driving it over the mountain. He had these boxes in his wagon that were labeled violins, handle with care. And he'd never seen this word violin. He had no idea what that meant. He thought it was some kind of death-dealing substance. So he carefully drove his Conestoga over the mountains, avoided every pothole and morass in the road until he got to Pittsburgh. And he waited until they unloaded the wagon and he could see, what are these violins? And when they opened up the boxes, he looked in astonishment and he said, "Well, them's just fiddles." So apparently there has been some confusion for quite some time on that subject. So anyway, I don't want to just talk the whole time. I do want to share with you some music. We're touching on traditional music too. And that's something that I really enjoy playing, is traditional music. And sometimes people have questions. Well, what is traditional music? Well, we could spend an hour talking about that. But to break it down and make it easy to understand, traditional music, or folk music, whichever way you want to say it, tends to be music or songs that you are familiar with. You know it, although you probably don't remember ever learning it. It's something that has just been passed down. Your parents knew it, their parents knew it, and we still know it today. And to prove this, I'm going to play a little tune for you. You've probably not heard this version before, but I think you might recognize it, and you might be able to come up with a name for me. that?
Turkey in the straw.
Turkey in the Straw. Now I'm sure you've never heard that version because that's an 1820s version. That's how the tune was played during that time. And it wasn't called Turkey in the Straw. It was called Natchez Under the Hill, or On the Hill, depending on your persuasion. So that tune in the 1850s gets borrowed for a minstrel song called Old Zip's Coon, and then it morphs over time, and it's what we know as Turkey in the Straw today, which is a little different. But there's still enough of that familiar theme in there that you recognize it. So that is what traditional music is. So we don't know a lot about the early traditional music in Kansas because we don't know a lot about the musicians either, and everything pre-recorded time is just kind of a mystery to us. But there's some things that we do know. We've got some early images of Kansas musicians. This is probably 1880s, we think, taken down in southern Kansas, south central Kansas, near the Turkey Track Ranch. And these are some of the ranch hands. And there's a lot of cool stuff going on in this picture here. We got the Sharps carbine down there, and revolver, and the jugs, and interesting. The sod house, there's just lots of cool stuff. But what really interests me is the cello. We've got a cello, and that's an instrument we may not think of seeing out here in Kansas much because we associate it with classical traditions. But the cello we find transcended all different genres, and it was used quite a bit in old-time string bands. And one thing about this cello is that we see it only has 3 strings instead of 4. And we see this quite often in old pictures of cellos. And it's never the same string missing. It's always a different one. And this has puzzled people, but I think the most logical explanation is that if you broke a string on the cello, you couldn't go to the hardware store. You had to order it and wait for it to come. And they were expensive. They weren't cheap. So if you broke a string, you just went without as long as you could. The other thing we got is the man in the dark coat has a harmonica, so he's probably playing the melody in the group. And then we have the guitar. And guitar, at that period, was not only just a rhythm instrument, but they could also play melody and rhythm together. Here we have another cello, and we have the fiddler on the roof. We've got an accordion, or sometimes, depending on where you're at, they could be called a flutina or various other names. And a rifle, I guess. So I'm not sure what they're doing here. Maybe a rendition of the 1812 overture. And this is way out in western Kansas. This is almost at the Colorado border. This is a group of Swedish immigrants way out west. And I really enjoy their instrumentation. We've got 2 fiddlers, which is, like I said, not uncommon to have 2 fiddlers at a dance. We've got 3 guitars. We don't always see this in old images. Sometimes it's just 1 guitar, sometimes 2. Today in the state of Kansas, if you go to a jam session about anywhere, whether it's a bluegrass jam or a folk jam or whatever, almost everybody has guitars. The guitars outnumber all the other instruments all the time because everybody plays guitar. And the guitar has always been a popular instrument. It's pretty easy to play, and you can accompany yourself while you're singing. But there's probably a different reason why there's so many guitars at this time in this image. It's because these were parlor instruments. They weren't as loud as our modern guitars are. And so you needed more of them to create the volume to back up these fiddles and provide the rhythm for a dance. And the fiddles, even though they're small instruments, and many had gut strings still at that time, they're still pretty loud. We've also got the mandolin here. We see the mandolin throughout Kansas, and we'll probably talk about it a little more. And then we've got this oddball over here with a piccolo. I don't know how that fit in, but he must have made it work. So, one of the earliest Kansas fiddlers to be commercially recorded is Sam Long. And he actually was born just kind of up the highway from where I grew up, south of Topeka at Scranton is where he lived. And he moved all over the country. I think he was in California for a time, worked in the gold fields. He was in Oklahoma. In 1926, while he was living in Oklahoma, he attended the Joplin, Missouri Fiddle Contest, and he won. And part of the prize for winning that contest was some recording time. So he went to a studio somewhere and recorded 4 sides. And among those recordings were Seneca Square Dance, which is still popular and well played today. Listen to the Mockingbird. I want to say Sandyland, or Great Big Taters in Sandyland. And Echo of the Ozarks, which is a well-known tune in Missouri and Arkansas and still played quite a bit there. The first one to record Echoes of the Ozark, actually. So I'd like to play for you Seneca Square Dance, because that's one tune that we hear quite a bit nowadays. Thank you. So Sam Long, he went on, he ended up living in Wichita, and I believe that's where he died in 1931. You can get on YouTube and other various online archives, and you can listen to some of his recordings. You can hear him playing today. His actual albums to find are very rare, and usually you're going to have to fork out a lot of money if you want to buy one. I've seen 2 come up for sale on eBay in like the past 2 years, and I thought I was going to get one. I bid $75 and still got outbid. That was as much as I wanted to pay. But you can get online and you can listen to him. You may not find him under Sam Long. You may have to search for Fiddling Dave Neal. And that's something we see quite a bit in these early recordings, is that artists had pseudonyms, sometimes 3 or 4 or 5. And so it makes it really difficult for us today to track these people down and get it all straightened out. Another Kansas fiddler, he's not actually from Kansas, he's from Arkansas, is Uncle Bob Larkin. And he was a champion fiddler, won lots of contests, but about 1926 or so he moves to Kansas, to Milford, where there's a radio station, KFKB. And I've actually got some things up here that relate to KFKB. But anyway, Larkin was, he was a really good fiddler. He recorded some too. You can also listen to him. He recorded Seneca Square Dance, which I just played for you, but he called it Higher Up the Monkey Climbs and played it in a different key. But it's kind of a funny little tune. There was at these old contests, Kansas also had contests. We may not get into that, but at these old contests, you know, this was kind of a big deal. People would come from all over to compete, and the prizes were really practical. It wasn't just always money. In fact, it was seldom money. Usually it was stuff like, you're going to get $50 worth of lumber if you place first. Or maybe you'll get an organ, a parlor organ, or maybe a piano, or maybe a rocking chair, or maybe a china set, or maybe 2 bags of flour. It was always something that was useful. A new suit of clothes, new shoes, something that you could use. So these were a big deal. People would come from all over to participate in these contests. But sometimes you had harvest, and so you couldn't make it to the contest. So there was this one guy who kind of grumbled about Larkin winning the contest. He said, well, the only reason he won is because I couldn't be there to beat him. And so Larkin accommodated him and drove to his location and beat him anyway. Here we have a couple of other Flint Hills fiddlers. On your far right with the dog is Henry Rogler. You might recognize the barn in the background, says Pioneer Bluffs on it. This is down north of Matfield Green, just off Highway 177 as you're driving between Cottonwood Falls and Cassidy. It's become a pretty iconic place now, but Henry pretty much made Pioneer Bluffs what we know and see today. He's the one that built all that and developed it. He went to K-State, went through the agricultural school, and then was really pretty heavily involved in the agricultural world in Kansas through most of his life. But he was a fiddler too, and he got started fiddling when he was a teenager. He sold subscriptions to the Youth's Companion magazine, and he'd get points for selling these. And after he got enough points, he sent in a little money, and they sent him a violin through the mail. And that's how he first started playing. He'd stay at home and work on tunes, playing them by ear. And pretty soon, family history says that he was playing for barn dances in that part of the county. Henry had a worker, Joe King, who is in the bib overalls, second from your left. And he came from Arkansas and pretty much worked for Henry his whole life. But there was this tune that Joe King played, and I learned it from another fiddler down in Matfield Green, June Talkington. And June would play this tune for us at Friday nights at the Emma Chase Cafe in Cottonwood Falls, where we had live music. And he'd say, "Get up here, let's play this tune." And he always called it Joe King's Schottish, because nobody knew the name of it. And so that's what we knew it as, but we started calling it June's Schottish because we learned it from June. And so I'd like to play for you a tune that I learned from June, and he learned from Joe King, and probably Henry Rogler as well, and has probably been played in the Chase County area for the past 80 years as far as we know. It wasn't until years after June had passed away that I finally learned what the name of the tune was. It's an old song, probably from at least the 1820s, but it was popular through the Civil War. It was called "The Captain with His Whiskers." And I also know that that tune used to be popular and sung in Kansas through the 1880s and 90s. So I find it interesting that in Chase County, this popular song became a dance tune and had been used that way for years. Well, we could keep talking about the fiddlers for a long time, but let's move on to the first brass band to come to Kansas. Joe Savage was one of the members of the first brass band to come to Kansas. He and his brother Forrest and two of their cousins lived in Hartford, Vermont, and they played in the city brass band there. And in 1854, they decided to come to Kansas. We know what was going on in 1854 in Kansas?
Land.
Pre-Civil War.
Well, either homestead.
It had just opened up as a territory. And so the New England states were wanting to send people to help settle it as a free state and prevent it from becoming another slave state in the West. So that was the reason why the Savages wanted to come to Kansas. They wanted to be part of this movement. So this is spring of 1854, late summer of 1854, I think. They're standing on the train platform in Boston, getting ready to go. They have their instruments with them. Now, as the story goes, John Greenleaf Whittier had just written a poem for this occasion called "The Kansas Immigrant." And a a well-known American composer at the time, Marion Dick Sullivan, who had written a lot of other popular pieces. She had just put his poem to music, but it didn't stick. It's not very interesting. I've tried playing it. I don't care for it. But what did stick is somebody figured out, well, hey, the meter of this verse goes with this song that everybody already knows. So the brass band pulls out their instruments and they start playing Auld Lang Syne, while everybody on the platform sings, "We cross the prairies as of old the pilgrims crossed the sea, to make the west as they, the east the homestead of the free." And so this became their anthem as they traveled by steamboat and rail to Kansas. And everywhere they stopped, people would gather to watch this group of immigrants and the band sing and play this song. Until they came to Missouri. And Missouri didn't appreciate that. But when they finally get to Kansas, they settle in Lawrence. So they're the first brass band of Lawrence in late 1854. A few more musicians became a part of it. But there's more to Savage's story. He was in Lawrence during Quantrill's raid in '63. And he's lucky that he survived. But long story short, he and his wife decided to head out of town that morning to their farm where they hoped they could find safety. So they threw a few things in the wagon. One of the things he threw in the wagon was his baritone horn. And as they are leaving, they come upon a group of Confederates that are killing somebody. And so Joe jumps the fence and hides in the cornfield. And his wife goes on with the wagon. They stop her. They search the wagon. They find his horn. And they think it has something to do with the military. And they weren't completely wrong, because the band had been using it to drill the militia in town and boost morale. So they took his horn and they beat it double over the iron tire of the wagon and tossed it out into the cornfield. Well, after the smoke clears, so to say, he retrieves his horn, sends it back east. The manufacturer refurbishes it, returns it to him. And the following year, October of 1864, we find him at Westport with his horn, the rest of the brass band and the militia, as they're fighting off Sterling Price. And then when that's over, they march back into Lawrence with the brass band leading them and singing "Johnny Comes Marching Home." So these are all parts of our music history that usually are neglected. We read about Quantrill's raid, we read about military history and the engagements, we read about political things, important people, but we usually ignore the music that was a part of that. And I think it's maybe because we don't feel that it's important. But it is. It's an integral part of our life. You can't go anywhere today, any store, without hearing music playing on the speakers. Music is such an integral part of who we are. So we touched on the Civil War. And there's a lot you could say about how the Civil War affected our music traditions, but one thing I like to point out is the fife and drum in Kansas. And in fact, I believe that fife and drum was probably the first Euro-American instruments to pass through what would become Kansas in the 1820s and 30s with the military escorts. It seems very likely, though we don't have documentation of that once again. We know that the field musicians were an integral part of the Army. They were there. We don't often read about them. But after the Civil War, 1866, December of that year, Kansas starts its Grand Army of the Republic organization. But it's not really till the 1880s that they start popping up in every town all over the state. And so at these GAR units, if you were fortunate, you had a fifer and drummer as part of that unit. And they would participate in Independence Day parades, picnics, public gatherings, Decoration Day ceremonies. And so we see them all over Kansas. And this is the Leavenworth group, but they're in Salina for some kind of event during this picture. 1918. What was going on in 1918? World War I. Here's a group of GAR veterans. We got the fife and drum at the head, and they're leading some World War I draftees to the depot to see them off. So this was something we saw in little communities all over Kansas until ultimately the Civil War veterans died off, and that was the end of it. So in February we had Black History Month, and so I threw in a bunch of images that I had of African American musicians in Kansas, and I liked it so well I decided, I'm just going to keep them in here because African American musicians are overlooked quite often. It's a part of our history we don't think about. We don't think about the white fiddlers and banjo players, and certainly the black fiddlers and banjo players. They get ignored as well. Most of these images, we don't know who these people are, but we have an idea about where they're from. This, we think, is from around Lawrence. It's from a Lawrence, Kansas studio. And we've got a wonderful assortment of instruments here. Got the 5-string banjo. And there's not a whole lot of images of 5-string banjo in Kansas. So that's another reason why I like this image. Which we will move on to the banjo here shortly. But to just kind of move through these again, we don't know who these people are. eBay is a great place to find information sometimes. This is a part of a panoramic photo that was taken up around Kansas City around the turn of the century. And we don't know what the occasion was, but these musicians in the picture caught my attention. And so I wanted to get them. We've got the double bass, mandolin, and a harp guitar, which we'll probably talk about in a little bit. This we think is in Jackson County, presumably a family of musicians, not uncommon, and quite an array of instruments. Cornet, there's the cello again, kind of a xylophone, and it's interesting that the gentleman holding the fiddle, you may not be able to see it very well, but the fiddle he's holding is one of these, a highly decorated and ornamented. Mine no longer has the inlay on the fingerboard like his. Those were pretty popular turn of the century. Marshall County, 1929. This is an interesting image because the instrumentation is changing. We saw the 5-string banjo earlier. By the 1920s, the 5-string banjo is taking a back seat. People are losing interest in it. They want to play tenor banjo. You also might notice that the guitar is not a 6-string guitar. It is a tenor guitar, a 4-stringed guitar. Those were the instruments that were becoming popular at that time with jazz. One African-American musician you should know, well, he's a singer. I don't know that he ever played anything. You should know about is George Walker. He was born in Lawrence, Kansas. He's buried there. He had a short life and short career, but he did a lot. He started out performing on the streets in Lawrence, dancing and singing. And then he gets into vaudeville, and he meets a guy named Burt Williams in San Francisco. And they team up to become probably the best-known African-American duo in the United States. And they recorded quite a bit right at the beginning of the century. You can also look up Burt Williams and George Walker and hear some of their recordings. But some of the best contributions I think Walker made, he and Burt both, made an organization to help their fellow black entertainers, because at that time the white organizations didn't care about the black entertainment. They had to take care of themselves. So it was kind of they helped them out financially, and they helped get them work, and just did a lot of good that they otherwise wouldn't have had. Another famous Kansan you should know about is Perry Lowry, or sometimes just called P.G. Lowry. He was born in Topeka and grew up on his family's farm in Greenwood County. Now the whole family were talented musicians and singers. They had a family band, the Star of the, I think it was Star of the East, maybe it was Star of the West brass band. And Perry was the youngest child. He played drums in the family band to start with, but later on he finds a cornet and he teaches himself how to play. And he does really well and ends up getting into the performances with circuses and becomes a leader of the African-American bands in many notable circuses throughout the United States, most notably Barnum and Bailey, but many others. And so he was the band leader. He wrote music, he arranged it, he even trained some people. He was friends with Scott Joplin, the king of ragtime, and Scott Joplin made some arrangements of some of his pieces for Lowry's band to play. In his day, they would have friendly competitions between bands and sometimes between the band leaders. And so he would compete against other cornetists, both black and white, and he was considered at that time, often billed, as the world's greatest colored cornetist. So that should speak to some of his talent. Another image I recently came across, don't know these guys, but it's in Abilene, Kansas, is where the photograph comes from. Again, 5-string banjo. This is probably, this could be late 1880s, maybe 1890s. So I just think it's a pretty cool instrumentation. And it will lead us into the banjo. You want to hear the banjo, don't you? So one thing a lot of people don't understand about the banjo is its African roots. We say that the banjo is truly an American invention, and what we know and see as the banjo today is of an invention on the North American continent. But its roots go back to Africa. In Senegal and Gambia, the instrument is still played there. It's called an accounting, and it is a gourd, it has a gourd body with the top cut off and a skin stretched over it, and then a round pole that sticks out of it. They called it a mast. We would call it a neck. Some people called it a handle. And then there would be strings attached to that mast, and it's played by striking it. So it's not only a melodic instrument because you're playing these notes, it's also a rhythm instrument because you're striking the drum head as you're playing. Well, the idea of the accounting came to this hemisphere with the slave trade, and we see it in the Caribbean, Jamaica, the coastal regions, and it changes a little bit during that time. It's still got the gourd body, but now it's got a flat board neck, and maybe they've put all the tuners up here at this time, and maybe there's some more strings on it too. So there's been lots of different variants of the instrument. But finally, about the 1840s, we come along with this style of banjo. I should have mentioned that in Jamaica in the 1600s it was called the banza. And so that's kind of where the banjo name morphed and comes from. So this is a replica of an 1845 Boucher banjo. This is essentially the first commercially produced banjo in America. And William Esperance Boucher was a drum maker in Baltimore. And I imagine it makes sense if you're making drum shells, you can cut those up and get several banjo pots out of them. But he came up with a number of ideas that improved the instrument. These little thumb screws, we call them wing nuts today, but this allows you to tighten and loosen the head. Prior to that, all the heads were tacked on, and so you couldn't tighten it. If you're playing in the evening and it soaks up the moisture, the skin gets slack and it sounds awful. You have to hold it up to a fire to get it to tighten up. So these thumb screws help that out. So I think there's a bit of moisture in the air here too, because it's a little droopy from what it normally is. So let me give you a little sample of mid-19th century banjo playing. We call this stroke style, and it's played with a finger and a thumb striking and plucking the strings. Wasn't the only technique that they were using on the banjo at that time. Many people that were taking up the instrument were guitarists. So they were applying the technique from the guitar to the banjo, which we would call finger style. They called it Spanish guitar style. of ways the instrument was played. I got one more I want to share with you. This is from 1855. This comes from Briggs' Banjo Instructor, which was the first publication on how to play the banjo. And this is, for all we know, it could have come from a plantation. Briggs spent time down south on the plantations listening to the enslaved play banjo, and this might be a piece that he heard from them, if it wasn't something he made up himself. But he called it Kicking Up the Devil on a Holiday. Thank you. So moving on through the 19th century, the banjo evolves, becomes a little more sophisticated. I want to share with you about this guy, John Henning. He has a Kansas connection, and he's a pretty important figure in the banjo world historically, but he's largely forgotten. A lot of people just don't know anything about him. But I've spent the past 3 or 4 years diligently researching him and struggling to find information, and every once in a while I get ahead. I make a win. Earlier this year I did a talk at Caldwell and talking about John Henning, and the sister-in-law of his granddaughter happened to be in the audience. And so I still haven't connected with the family, but I'm hoping they might have a little more information about him to share. But Henning lived in Emporia, Kansas in the early 1880s. That's where I first learned about him. I lived at Council Grove, so I did a lot of research in that area. But I find this guy, Henning, mentioned in the banjo journals of S.S. Stewart at that time. He's a teacher of the banjo in Emporia. And so I'm curious about him, so I tried to find out more. Well, through the years, I find out what an important guy he is. He was not only a teacher of the banjo, he came up with some innovations for the instrument. And in fact, I have here a John Henning banjo. This was probably manufactured about 1895. He came up with some really innovative ideas at the time, and I consider this the Cadillac of the banjo of the day. And it's really a shame that more people didn't buy these and he didn't produce more of them, because they were ahead of their time. Most banjos at this period were built for gut strings. And in fact, many manufacturers would advertise, don't use wire strings on our instruments, it will ruin them, and your warranty will be void. This might be the first banjo that was specifically designed for wire strings. You could use either gut or wire. And that's because Henning put a brace. There's a steel brace running all the way from the peg head, down the neck, through the dowel stick, which makes it very rigid. This neck is as straight as the day it was made. And because it makes it so strong, he can make the neck thinner down here, which makes it much more comfortable to play at these higher positions. But probably the most innovative thing that he did, and the most noticeable thing that people find about Henning, is he got rid of the 5th string tuner here, so that your hand can move up and down unimpeded by that. And he put the tuner on the tailpiece, which is a novel idea. It's not real practical, but it works. I'll give him that. But he did a number of other things that were interesting, but those are the main points. Henning was also a composer of music. He wrote music for the banjo, for mandolin, guitar. And I'd like to play for you a Henning piece on the Henning banjo. This is called Oakwood March. might notice the style of banjo playing changed as we come up through the century. This is referred to today as classic style playing. It's the Spanish guitar style that I showed earlier applied to the banjo. We get into more ragtime, we get into marches and waltzes and such. And the instruments, you might notice, also sound different. And that's because the early banjos were tuned a lot lower. With the invention of wire strings and better banjos, they were able to raise the pitch so it gets a brighter sound later on. We didn't talk about Meta Henning, which is John's wife. They first met in Chicago, and he was teaching her banjo. I suspect she maybe had already played banjo at that time, but wanted a little more instruction. She was a very talented guitarist. She had learned to play guitar from her father. And in fact, some people claimed that Meta's talent exceeded her husband's. But after they got married, they were a husband and wife duo, performing and teaching, and continued until John died. And they were in LA when he died, is where they were last living. I threw a couple pictures in here because I've had people comment, well, there doesn't seem to be many women in a lot of these photos. There doesn't seem to be a lot of women fiddlers or musicians. What's the deal with that? Well, it seems that leisure activity was largely male dominated, but it was not always the case. There's a number of instances of all-female bands in Kansas. White City had one, Harrington had one, Udall had one, and I wouldn't be surprised if there were a bunch more. But we do see women getting involved in music, and particularly through the 1880s and 90s, ladies are learning to play the banjo. It had become a parlor instrument at that time, like the guitar, and they're learning to play the instrument. This is a pretty important family in Kansas music traditions because they did a great job documenting their family's traditions. And I could give a whole program just on them alone, but suffice it to say, Myron Hull, who's center back with the mandolin, about 1905 he starts up a Metropolitan School of Music in Wichita. I'm not sure how long it lasted, but he was trained at some point in his early life by the nation's leading mandolinist, Samuel Sigel, in Pennsylvania, when he was there for a time. We've got some other harp guitars here. I mentioned harp guitars earlier. Harp guitars have been around in one form or another for hundreds of years, but this style kind of got popular around the mid-19th century, early 19th century. We see some in the 1860s, but at the turn of the 20th century is when they start becoming really popular because we have mandolin orchestras. And the harp guitar provided extra bass. If you didn't have a cello, if you didn't have a bass, those extra sub-bass strings would fill out that part of your ensemble. So mandolin clubs, mandolin orchestras, a lot of people are like, what is that? They've never heard of such a thing. It's basically like a string quartet. You have the violin, the viola, the cello, the bass, only it's all mandolin. So you'd have a mandolin, mandola, mandocello, and mando bass. And here we have a lovely Gibson harp guitar. I've got one similar to this at home. It's a little bit later model. These are all Gibson instruments. What I wouldn't give to have them. Several thousands of dollars worth of instruments there. But these mandolin clubs you would find almost all over the state. Every town might have one. Often the colleges would. K-State had an all-ladies mandolin club. They also had a banjo in it. I think they had a xylophonist. KU had a mandolin club, and they were the first one to actually travel the state. In the 1890s, they began traveling and performing. Let's see, I'm not sure who else. Just about every town I've noticed had at least one or two mandolin clubs from about the 1890s through the 1920s. Back down to Wichita, this is June Frisbee's Academy. This is probably about 1927 this photo's taken. I mentioned the mando bass. There's the mando bass there, that big, funny instrument produced by Gibson. Again, the time period of this, the instrumentation is changing. No more 5-string banjos. The tenor banjo is all the rage. So we've got tenor banjos. We've still got some mandolins there, and the ukulele is coming in. I'm not sure what time it is. Okay, so I'm going to skip Byron Harlan here, even though he's great. So we talked about the ukulele. So I want to share with you about a famous ukulele player who was born here in Potawatomi County. St. George is in Potawatomi County, right? Okay, good.
Wow.
Wendell Hall may not be a name that you recognize, but he was born in St. George. He's buried up the hill from where I live in Manhattan. I can go up to the cemetery and visit him anytime. His mother and father, his father was the preacher at the Christian church in Manhattan in like the 1880s. After Wendell Hall was born, they moved out of the state. So he wasn't in Kansas very long, but I find it interesting that he's back. They buried him here. But the family moves to Chicago, and that's pretty much where he gets started in his musical career. He plays xylophone. When he was very young, he'd start learning to play the xylophone. He was very good at it. He could use 4 mallets, and he could sing while he played. That's why he was called the singing xylophonist. Not many people in vaudeville could do that at that time. He gets in the vaudeville circuit and starts traveling northern United States and even into Canada, and is pretty successful and popular. He starts writing his own music because sometimes he'd be at a show and the act before him would sing his material. And he decided, you know, if I write my own stuff, they won't have it. And then he wouldn't have to make changes at the last minute. So he starts writing his own songs and publishing them and getting pretty popular. He ends up punching his manager in the nose for getting fresh with the girl that he liked on vaudeville. And that pretty much ended his vaudeville career. But that was okay because radio was coming out at that time. And he was there at the advent of Chicago radio. He got involved. He'd have to move this 6-foot heavy xylophone back and forth from home to the studio, and he got tired of that. So he switched to an instrument that was much easier to transport, the ukulele. He played the ukulele for some time, but this now became the instrument he would be known for, was the ukulele. And in fact, this is a Wendell Hall ukulele. This was produced probably right around 1925. Regal made the Wendell Hall Redhead uke for just a few short years at that time because he was becoming really popular on radio. Another cool thing that most people aren't aware of is that he wrote a wildly popular song that I bet you know. It's called It Ain't Gonna Rain No More. And it was just 100 years ago, last October, that song was released. And it sold 2 million copies. So we've got to sing It Ain't Gonna Rain No More. And the lyrics might be a little different than you are familiar with, but I think you'll catch on. Oh, the night was dark and dreary, the air was full of sleet. The old man stood out in the storm with his shoes all full of feet. Oh, it ain't gonna rain no more, no more. It ain't gonna rain no more. But how in the world can the old folks tell it ain't gonna rain no more? Oh, mosquito, he fly high, mosquito, he fly low. If old man Skeeter ever lights on me, he ain't gonna fly no more. Oh, it ain't gonna rain no more, no more. It ain't gonna rain no more. How in the world can the old folks tell it ain't gonna rain no more? Oh, the butterfly flits on wings of gold, the June bug wings of flame. The bed bug has no wings at all, but he gets there just the same. Oh, it ain't gonna rain no more, no more. It ain't gonna rain no more. How in the world can the old folks tell it ain't gonna rain no more? Here's a verse about a man and a trombone. The words to it are few. He blew, he blew, he blew, he blew. He blew, he blew, he blew. Oh, it ain't gonna rain no more, no more. It ain't gonna rain no more. How in the world can the old folks tell it ain't gonna rain no more? Oh, little black and white animal out in the woods that says, isn't that little cat pretty? I went over to pick it up. It wasn't that kind of a kitty. Oh, it ain't gonna rain no more, no more. It ain't gonna rain no more. How in the world can the old folks tell it ain't gonna rain no more? I can squeeze in one more guy, this is one more Kansas notable that you should be familiar with if you're not. Carson Robison. He was born in southeastern Kansas, around Pittsburgh area, and he was born into a musical family. I believe his mother played piano. His father was supposed to be an expert fiddler, and Carson actually played multiple instruments, but mostly we see him playing the guitar, and I think the harmonica once in a while. In Kansas, if you want to make it big into music, it's like Kansas City is the stepping stone for that. So in the 1920s, we find Carson Robison at the Mulebach Hotel in Kansas City, where they have a radio station. And he's playing with the Coon Sanders Nighthawk Orchestra, the Enemies of Sleep. And it was there, in 1924, he runs into somebody. Wendell Hall was on a radio tour. And he meets Carson Robison and maybe isn't so impressed with his guitar playing or his singing, but he thought that his whistling style was really unique. Carson Robison could warble like a bird, and it's that technique that actually earned him the nickname of the Kansas Jaybird later on. But Hall pays for Robison's train fare to New York City, where they cut 4 sides, and one of the songs that they recorded is called Whistling the Blues Away. And I always encourage everybody to look this one up and listen to it. Whistling the Blues Away. It features Robison on the guitar, and Wendell Hall is singing, and they have this duet that they perform of Robison whistling and Hall playing the slide whistle, which was actually the very first thing he was ever recorded doing before he ever sang. I don't know how that anybody else could have pulled it off, but those two did it, and it sounds really neat. So give that a listen. During the 1920s, most of the 1920s, Robison teams up with Vernon Dalhart, and they're recording extensively a lot of ballads, mountain ballads, and sentimental songs. Robison's also writing a lot of music at that time too, so some of his music is being recorded too. After Dalhart, I do want to mention that Dalhart and Robison are considered by some to be the fathers of country music. So I think that's pretty cool. After Dalhart, he teams up with a couple of other brothers from Kansas. Frank and Phil Crow was their real name, but they went by Luther in the industry. And the 3 of them recorded quite a bit in the 30s. And then after that, he records with another Kansas notable. I've got a picture of her up here, Pearl Pickens from Lebo, Kansas, who went to Juilliard to be trained in voice. And she ends up playing with his buckaroos in the 1930s. Frank Luther ends up marrying Zora Lehman, a talented violinist from Hutchinson, Kansas, and they go on to record quite a bit through the 1940s and 50s. And in fact, my favorite Christmas album to listen to is Frank and Zora Lehman's old-time Christmas songs. It's a bunch of stuff you've probably never heard before. So that pretty much brings us to the end of that. But I got one more song I want to sing for you. I brought the guitar, and I'd hate to have to pack it up without having played it. But I want to sing for you a Carson Robison tune. He wrote lots of humorous tunes, which I appreciate. One of them was in 1942. He did the true folkloric thing, and he made a new version of Turkey in the Straw, and kind of touched on what was happening at that time. Oh, Adolf Hitler grabbed a tail, he held on with a tooth and nail. When he saw what he had, he began to swear. At the end of that tail was a Russian bear. The old bear ground started in to shake. Adolf knew he made a mistake. Tried to hang on and he tried to let go. Now they got a new dance called Hitler in the Snow. But another fun one that he did was Way Out West in Kansas. And he first recorded it with Dalhart in the 20s, and then later with his buckaroos in the 1930s. And this is one he wrote. There's a place where the birds sing bass, the rabbits laugh in the bulldog's face. Train don't stop in my hometown, 'cause the woodpeckers knocked the depot down. Where the girls grow tall and thin, the boys grow whiskers on their chin. Their ears grow out and their toes grow in out in that western town. Now folks don't stay out very late, way out west in Kansas. They take the sidewalks in at 8, way out west in Kansas. In some towns, by heck I swear, you can stand in the old town square and knock on every front door there, way out west in so old she's muscle bound. The folks all say she built the town. She's got the 17 turned around way out west in Kansas. An old man stopped to take a rest way out west in Kansas. He sat right down in a hornet's nest way out west in Kansas. The hornets quickly took offense, left their trademark on his pants. He's been standing ever since way out west in Kansas. Well, I think that pretty much does it. There's so much more we could talk about, but you'll have to wait till I get my book published, whenever that might be. And then you can hear the whole story. So, anybody has any questions, I'm happy to try to answer them.
Of all the instruments, which do you think's the hardest to learn? I know they're all easy for you.
Well, from a teacher's perspective, I would say the violin is the hardest to learn because it takes a lot of technique and discipline. But for me, learning the banjo was pretty hard.
Bill, you play the guitar, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. I haven't heard you play for a while, but he is a guitarist.
Well, my fingers are getting kind of old and stiff.
Old and stiff. How many of you could sense the passion that Derrick has for his music?
Oh, yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
It just sparkles in you.
Every instrument comes so easy, it seems like, for him to play.
Do you play any, like, saxophone and anything like that?
I played trumpet through most of school. Used to play trumpet in the community band, but I gave that up. I think I had heat exhaustion one day. Our band played, the community band played out, it was like 95 degrees in the shade, and we just finished Alexander's Ragtime Band, the trumpet trio. It was great, and I thought I was going to black out, so I haven't really touched the trumpet since.
How did you get started with music?
Well, my mother says that when I was in diapers, I'd be somewhere piddling around in the house, and when the Beverly Hillbillies show came on TV and the theme song for that, I'd run to the TV and stand there, and I'd just watch until the Ballad of Jed Clampett was done, and then I'd go back to playing. So I guess I've always been interested in music, but actually playing music, I got started with piano. My grandmother got me piano lessons when I was about 8, and pretty much continued that up through high school. Never was very good at the piano. It's got too much going on, but really was interested in the fiddle. And part of what spurred me in that direction was the stories from my family that my great-grandfather used to play fiddle for barn dances on our family farm. And I just thought, well, that sounds fun. I want to do that. I want to be able to do that. So I pestered my parents until they got me a violin for Christmas one year, and I pretty much taught myself how to play because there was nobody around playing the fiddle where we lived. And so yeah, my great-grandfather played, and I thought, okay, we're gonna have barn dances. And about a week before I had scheduled to have friends and neighbors over for a barn dance in our barn, it blew over in a windstorm, so that was the end of that. But I have since been able to play in other people's barns around the state of Kansas, so that's been fun.
Where did you go to school?
Meridazine Valley,
Meridazine Valley.
which is in Osage County. It's Melvern and Quinnamo were consolidated school district. So I grew up right between Melvern Lake and Pomona Lake, which I understand had tornadoes last night. So.
Yes.
Yeah.
The other question, do you give lessons on any of your instruments?
I do. I teach privately at home, mostly fiddle, banjo. I've been doing a lot of ukulele lessons here recently. I guess that's popular.
That's great. That's great.
Well, we sure want to thank you for sharing with us today, and I think you have,
I do.
talk about that a little bit?
She mentioned at the intro, I play with Tallgrass Express String Band. I brought some CDs. This is our latest CD. It's actually 2. So there is our 32 tracks on here. A lot of music, all written by Annie Wilson, who is the Flint Hills balladeer. So they're all original, but they're about the Flint Hills region, the flora, the fauna, the traditions, and we started on this project in 2019 and got 10 songs recorded when COVID shut everything down. And at that point, we didn't know what was going to happen, so we released what we had, which was 10 songs. And then after COVID, we started up and finished, and Annie had written some more songs by then, so we had to add them to this. So anyway, if you're interested in a CD, these are $10. It's a bargain. They're worth 3 times that. Give you a little sample of what we do.
Any other questions or comments? One of my granddaughters is learning the violin.
Oh, great.
So I'm going to have to get one of your CDs to inspire her. So, we do want to thank you all for coming. Did everybody sign up for the door prize? Did you sign a little piece of paper? Okay. The door prize is a duck. It was carved by a person that lives in Colorado, and he sent all these wooden carvings to us, to the Historical Museum, to do with what we wanted to. And this duck has been sitting there just wanting a new home, so somebody gets to take the duck home. And the person that gets to take the duck home is Dennis Swant. So be sure to get your duck. We have refreshments across the room. Robin, of course, is always in charge of those, or seems like she always is, and likes to have a little bit fancy. So if you would like to get some cookies and some drink and visit a little more with Derrick, that would be great. Let's give him a good round of applause for taking the time and coming today. And even though our audience is small, we do find that when Deanna puts it on YouTube, we have quite a following, don't we, Deanna?
Yeah.
And so, you know, it might be your audience is actually 4,000 people by the time we get through with the entire event. So I thank you very much, and please go help yourself to some refreshments.
Bill, do you want me